Hi, I'm going to read you guys the Mental Health Through Will Training book by Abraham Lowe. This was the first self help book I ever read. I read it with my mom when I was little. She was trying to overcome agoraphobia, and I found it very helpful. Normally, I do videos on addiction recovery and rational recovery and AVRT. If you have any problems with that, please check out my other videos. Okay, this is the preface. The present volume is meant to give an account of the psychotherapy methods evolved in the past 15 years by Recovery Inc., a nonprofit group whose purpose it is to train post-psychotic and psychoneurotic persons in the practice of psychiatric self-help. An, ex- an extensive report on the association's history, scope of activity, and mode of operation was offered in 1943. A concise but fairly comprehensive description was published in 1949. The contents of the book are in the main reproductions of panel discussions conducted by the ex-patients and group psychotherapy interviews held by the author with his private patients in the years 1944 to 1949. Several essays on sabotage have been added, describing the manner in which patients offer resistance to the physician's instructions. The bulk of the material was previously published in the Recovery Journal and Recovery News issued by Recovery Inc. and edited by the author. It deals with the system of group psychotherapy evolved by the writer since 1933. Psychotherapy, individual or group, is invariably based 1. On a philosophy, 2. On techniques. In years past, the field was dominated by three main philosophies and techniques: Freud's psychoanalysis, Adler's individual psychology, and Jung's approach, which, because of its vagueness and mysticism, defies precise classification. More recently, the psychoanalytic doctrine has taken the lead and all but crowded out its erstwhile rivals. It established its hegemony in universities and philanthropic foundations and gained unquestionable prominence in the province of psychotherapy. The doctrine appears to be in firm control in the official psychiatric organizations, in the mental hygiene activities of the national government, in the Veterans Administration, presumably also in the hospitals of the armed forces. Official psychotherapy in the United States today is essentially psychoanalysis. The author rejects the psychoanalytic doctrine both in philosophy and in therapeutic technique. In point of philosophy, he cannot share the view that human conduct is the result of unconscious drives, sexual or otherwise. To his way of thinking, adult life is not driven by instincts but guided by will. In emphasizing the priority of will over drives, he is merely echoing the principles and teachings of the late Professor Emil Kraepelin, founder of modern psychiatry. Kraepelin is spelled Kraepelin, and those of the late Professor William Wundt, Wundt, father of modern psychology. Quite proudly, he claims also to echo the voice of the common experience and common sense. Whatever may be meant by drives, be they instinctual cravings, the favorite psychoanalytic term, or emotional trends, desires, wishes, yearnings, and leanings, they all eventuate in impulses, acting or ready for action. To the author, it is inconceivable that adult human life can be ordered without a will holding down impulses. What precisely is meant by the term will is amply demonstrated in the text. In point of psychotherapeutic techniques, psychoanalysis must be accounted a failure on the evidence of its own testimony. The most startling deficit is in the insignificant number of patients which can be reached by this method. The Chicago Institute of Psychoanalysis, for instance, has been able to report no more than 319 patients treated 6 months or longer during the 10-year period. The Menninger Clinic of Topeka, Kansas, tops this record of poor productivity with a report of 100 patients similarly treated. For 6 months or longer in the course of 10 years, 1932 to 1941. In order to fully appreciate the story told by these astonishing figures, one must remember that the two institutions are generously staffed and richly financed. Knight, tabulating the results of treatment as published by the Psychoanalytic Institutes of Berlin, London, Topeka, 10-year surveys, and Chicago, 5 years, was unable to quote more than 660 cases treated for upward of 6 months in the 4 clinics during the 10-year period, 5 years in Chicago. Of the total, 363 patients were treated in Berlin, 114 in Chicago, and 100 in Topeka, and 74 in London. Stating in otherwise, the productivity of psychoanalytic techniques, as reported from 4 leading clinics, ranged in point of the number of patients carried per year, from 7.4 London to 36.3 Berlin. Figures of this kind admit of one conclusion only. The psychoanalytic techniques are available for a small fraction of only of the multitude of post-psychotic and psychoneurotic patients. The reason for its restricted availability is the egregious amount of time needed for the administration of the treatment, an overall average of hundreds of hours being required for each individual patient. For patients cared for in private practice, there is the added handicap that the time-consuming process involves a necessary exorbitant expense. Whether the emphasis be on the time factor or the cost element, in either case, the method is all but unavailable for the masses of patients. Aside from its limited availability for numerically significant groups of patients, psychoanalysis is also, again on the evidence of its own testimony, therapeutically ineffective. Knight, assaying therapeutic results obtained from 660 analyses conducted for 6 months or longer in the Institute of Berlin, London, Chicago, and Topeka, tells us that 183 patients, that's 27.7%, were considered apparently cured. 186, 28.2%, were much improved, and 291, 44.1%, were either somewhat improved or worse, or showed no change. Needless to say, 27.7% yield of apparently cured patients, even adding the 28.2% of much improved contingent, constitutes a serious indictment for a psychotherapeutic method. Oberndorf is authority for the statement that 40% of the psychotic cases treated with psychoanalysis plus institutional regime at the Menninger Clinic were discharged as cured. He comments that this is also the percentage of those discharged as cured from mental health hospitals in the United States. It is well known, however, that 40% figure for cures of state hospital patients represents the spontaneous recovery rate. It is permissible, then, to draw the inference that for psychotic patients, at any rate, results of psychoanalytic treatment are identical with spontaneous chances of outgrowing their psychosis. Taking either the hint offered by Oberndorf or the disappointing figures supplied by the above-mentioned statistics, the conclusion seems inescapable that psychoanalysis has failed as a therapeutic technique. It is not intended here to criticize psychoanalysis with the view to extolling the work of Recovery Inc., but inasmuch as the psychoanalytic method has well nigh monopolized the field of psychotherapy, and it is incumbent on a diverging approach to measure its record of accomplishment against that of the recognized procedure. A few simple figures called from the files of the author will demonstrate that the combination of office treatment with the group methods practiced in Recovery Inc. achieves a range of availability which dwarfs that of psychoanalysis. Between January 1st of 1946 and December 31st of 1947, in a representative 2-year period, the author was able to examine in his office a total of 425 new patients. Deducting from this figure those patients who did not return after the initial examination, 140, those who suffered from somatic and neurological conditions, 24, there remained 261 subjects who were available for psychotherapy. Of this final group, 156 were given treatment for 6 months or longer. In other words, employing the methods described in this book, one man was enabled to give active psychiatric care to a considerable multiple of the patients serviced in the comparable period by large staffs of the psychoanalytic institutions. Clearly, the recovery method is vastly superior to psychoanalysis in the matter of availability to the masses of patients seeking psychiatric care. As concerns the therapeutic effectiveness of the recovery techniques, as described from mere availability, it is sufficient to point to the basic character of the organization. The members know one another. They meet frequently and regularly in classes and at parties. They get together in family gatherings and consort socially. They form sewing clubs, bowling parties, and dancing teams. Many of them spend evenings or Sundays together, dining or visiting theaters and amusement places. One can readily surmise what would happen if no more than the negligible 28% of the lot would finally reach the status of apparently cured. The organization would explode in no time. Instead, the association, staffed by one physician, financed without outside assistance, shunning though not completely escaping publicity, has prospered close to 15 years. This record speaks for itself. It needs no statistics to support its claim. This is page 15 of the Mental Health Through Will training book by Abraham A. Lowe. A concise outline of recovery self-help techniques. Recovery Inc. was founded on November 7, 1937, by 30 ex-patients who regained their health after receiving shock treatment and other therapies at the Psychiatric Institute of the University of Illinois Medical School. The predecessor of the present psychiatric department in Illinois Neuropsychiatric Institute. The author was at the time the assistant director of the institute between 1937 and 1940. The organization limited its services to patients admitted to the wards of the Psychiatric Institute. In the fall of 1940, it expanded its work to include the psychoneurotic patients of the outpatient department. In September 1941, the group severed its connection with the University of Illinois Medical School and established headquarters of its own in Chicago Loop District, where it is now located at 116 South Michigan Avenue. In the years since 1942, the bulk of its membership was recruited by the author's private practice. As is evident from this brief description, Recovery Inc. has had the opportunity to try out its techniques, 1, with an intramural patient population, 2, with an outpatient group, 3, with private patients. The object of the organization, apart from its tendency to save time for the physician and money for the patient, is to help prevent reoccurrence of mental diseases and to forestall chronicity in psychoneurotic conditions. Its technique places the emphasis on self-help. The residual system of the recovered mental patient. After leaving the hospital, the mental patient is supposed to be restored to health. This is true in most instances if by mental health is meant the absence of delusions or hallucinations, of violent impulses, and the indifference to group standards. But Returning home, the patient still suffers from restlessness, tenseness, and preoccupation. His inability to relax is aggravated by the sense of being stigmatized. Many return patients are so suspicious of being watched, or mistrusted that even simple inquiries like, "How do you feel?" or "How are you today?" are likely to cause irritation. These innocent questions may suggest to the patient that the reality of his recovery is doubted. Feeling stigmatized, the patient becomes self-conscious and introspective. On a given night, he might have difficulty falling asleep. This is apt to alarm him. The alarm increases the difficulty of sleeping. Then more alarm, more sleeplessness, and yet more alarm. A vicious cycle is thus set going, which may keep the patient from properly resting night after night. Other vicious cycles may soon establish themselves. The patient notices a sense of fatigue, which in itself may be as insignificant as any sensation of fatigue experienced by the average person. But feeling stigmatized, he correlates his tiredness with the possibility of a relapse. And the more he dreads the relapse, the more intense becomes his fatigue. The heavier the fatigue, the more haunting the fear of the relapse. One patient had a nocturnal itch after returning home. Another complained of a twitch in one arm. A third felt a hair on her tongue. Experiences of this kind are distressing enough to conjure up the vision of an impending relapse. Experiences become far more terrifying when the patient observes, for instance, that the arm suddenly begins to shake in automatic motions when awful flashes shoot across the eye. Patients reported an electric buzz running through the muscles. That the tongue lay stiff in their mouth, that my voice sounded strange, that the ear felt pushed in, that I can't seem to hear myself when I speak. Palpitations, numbness, head and chest pressures, dizziness, difficulty in concentration, dimness in vision, air hunger, headaches, nausea, and scores of other disturbances were reported by numerous patients. Observations of this sort may give rise to a vicious cycle which has the familiar characteristic of the symptom increasing the fear and the fear intensifying and perpetuating the symptom. While there is no statistic to substantiate the claim, it is fair to assume that many reoccurrences of mental ailment are a direct result of these residual symptoms, which, fanned by the fury of a vicious cycle, produce anxieties and panics, which finally necessitate the much dreaded recommitment. Recovery Inc. insists that the patient, prior to leaving the hospital, attend group psychotherapy classes, in which he is given adequate instruction how to face the threat of residual symptom and pressure of stigmatization. At the same time, the members of the family are urged to attend discussion courses in which similar instruction is offered. In this manner, the pre-discharge care prepares for the aftercare effort. The defeatism of the chronic psychoneurotic patient. Most residual symptoms from which the return mental patient is likely to suffer are similar to or identical with the common complaints voiced by psychoneurotic patients, hence the possibility of treating both groups by the same method. The psychoneurotic patients admitted to Recovery Inc. belong in the category of chronic, protracted cases mainly. Patients with symptoms of a few months' duration are rarities in the ranks of the group. Most members have a record of from 2 to 20 years of suffering. These experienced sufferers have made the rounds of physicians and clinics and were assured on numerous occasions, explicitly or by implication, that some therapeutic measure will cure them. The assurance never materialized, with the result that they no longer believe a cure is possible. They know, however, that some or most of the past therapies had a transient palliative effect. The palpitations were milder after a reassuring talk. The dizziness yielded to a sedative. Hence they treasure the pep talk or the prescription. In order to secure these elusive aids, they must complain, and they must convince the physician that they really that they really suffer, that their pains are not imaginary, that they can positively not stand their fatigue. To get a hearing from the doctor is all the more important because at home, their complaints are likely to be met with impatience or ridicule. Complaining then becomes a vital part of their daily routine. In the course of years, they develop the consummate art of the expert complainer. What these long term patients crave is a sympathetic ear, which, after years of griping, they can no longer secure from their their relatives and friends. They delight in a lengthy discussion of their fears and frustrations. Their ideal is to be explored, analyzed, sounded, and probed. Essentially, they have decided that their case is beyond repair. What they expect is a hearing, perhaps some temporary relief, but not a final cure. The chronicity of this group has little to do with the nature of the symptoms. With diagnoses or etiology, it is self-appointed defeatism. Since recovery places the emphasis on the self-help action of the patient, you must ignore investigations and explorations which are not within the province of inexperienced laypersons. Complexes, childhood memories, dream experiences, and subconscious thought play little part in the class interviews conducted by the physician and are entirely eliminated from the self-help effort carried on by the patients. The psychoneurotic individual is considered a person who, for some reason, developed disturbing symptoms leading to ill-controlled behavior. The symptoms are in the nature of threatening sensations, intolerable feelings, uncontrollable impulses, and obsessive, unbearable thoughts. The very vocabulary, with its frenzied emphasis on the killing headache and the dizziness that drives me frantic, the fatigue that is beyond human endurance, is ominously expressive of defeatism. The first step in the psychotherapeutic management of these chronic patients must be to convince them that the sensation can be endured, the impulse controlled, the obsession checked. Unfortunately, the physician is far from convincing. His attempt to sell the idea of mental health arouses the sales resistance of the patient. The physician doesn't dare tell me the truth, muses the patient. It would be against his ethics to declare me incurable. The resistance is easily overcome in the group interview. The fellow sufferer who explains how he licked his frightful palpitations after years of invalidism cannot possibly be suspected of trying to sell something. That colleague is convincing. He convinces the novice that chronic conditions are not hopeless. The patients meet on 3 days every week. On 3 separate days each week, the patients take part in group discussions, either as panel members or listeners. On Wednesday, family gatherings are held in private homes in various neighborhoods of Chicago. The patients are subdivided into 7 neighborhood groups, each comprising of 10 to 20 families. 3 such family groups function on the north side, 2 on the south side, 1 on the west side of the city. 1 serves the west suburbs. On the occasion of the family meeting, panels of 3 or 4 experienced members discuss a chapter of the author's 3 volumes on self-directed aftercare, or an article from our now discontinued Recovery Journal, or from its successor, the Recovery News. The theme is centered on the topic of symptoms and the proper means of conquering them. The physician is not present at the family gatherings, although he reserves the right to attend occasionally to check in on the effectiveness of the procedures. Reports are currently conveyed to him by the panel leaders. Tuesday evening is devoted to a group psychotherapy class conducted by the physician. Saturday afternoon, a public meeting takes place at Recovery Headquarters, 116 South Michigan Avenue. It is attended by the patients, their relatives, and friends. The first half hour is given over to a panel discussion similar to that held at the Wednesday home gatherings. The second half, the physician delivers an address in which he sums up the conclusions reached by the panel, approving or correcting their statements. The panel members are led by a panel leader. Treating the setback. Patients are required to attend classes and meetings for at least 6 months. The average patient experiences a considerable improvement in the first or second week of participation in the program. But the improvement is, as a rule, as short-lived as was the relief from the patient used to gain from the visits to clinics and doctors' offices. No meetings are held on 4 days of the week. During these days, the novice is apt to suffer a setback. He is again tortured by that awful fatigue, or has been unable to sleep a wink for 3 nights in succession, or the fear of doing harm to the baby reappears after it was gone for a short while. Every patient is warned to be on guard against the unavoidable setback. He is cautioned to contact a veteran recovery member immediately after the symptom has reappeared. The assurance offered by the veteran is in accord with the language used by the physician, and the interpretations given to the novice coincide with those used in the physician's classes and in his writings. New members are assigned to veterans whom they may call in distress. The veteran functions in the capacity of the physician's aide. The contact is generally made by telephone, but may be done by a personal visit to the aide's home. If the result is not satisfactory, the novice is permitted to call on the leader of his local panel. If this is ineffective, he may contact the chairman of the organization who serves as deputy to the physician. Finally, he may call the physician. The effectiveness of the scheme is evidenced by the fact that few instances are recorded in which the physician was called by novices. The symptomatic idiom. If the patients are to help and teach one another, they must be instructed to use the language which is not confusing. This is particularly important because language, if used glibly, tends to be alarmist and defeatist. By dint of its defeatist insinuations, language frequently engenders tenseness, which reinforces the perpetuates symptoms. To avoid the fatalistic implications of the language used by the patients, the physician must supply a terminology of his own in matters of health. There are many languages. Features and gestures speak, so do symptoms. Their language is a one-word idiom, danger. This is called symptomatic idiom. Accepting the suggestions of the symptomatic idiom, the patient considers the violent palpitations as presaging sudden death. The pressure in his head is viewed as due to a brain tumor. The tenseness is experienced as so terrific that the patient fears he is going to burst. His fatigue does not let up 1 single minute, and how long can the body stand it? In these instances, the implications of the symptomatic idiom are those of the impending physical collapse. If phobias, compulsions, and obsessions dominate the symptomatic scene, the resulting fear is that of the mental collapse. After months and years of sustained suffering, the twin fears of physical and mental collapse may recede, giving way to apprehensions about the impossibility of a final cure. This is the fear of the permanent handicap. The 3 basic fears of the physical collapse, mental collapse, and permanent handicap are variations of the danger theme suggested by the symptomatic idiom. The temperamental lingo. Another source of defeatism is temper. The patients are taught that temper has 2 divisions. The one comes into play when I persuade myself that a person has done me wrong. As a result, I become angry. This is called angry or aggressive temper, which appears in various shades and nuances: resentment, patience, indignation, disgust, hatred, etc. The other variety of temper is brought into action whenever I feel that I am wrong. This gives rise to moral, ethical, aesthetic fears, or to the fear of being a failure in pragmatic pursuits. I am afraid that I sinned, failed, blundered, in short, that I defaulted on a moral, ethical, or aesthetic standard, or on the standard of average efficiency. This is called the fearful or retreating temper, which may express itself in many different qualities and intensities. Discouragement preoccupation, embarrassment, worry, sense of shame, feeling of inadequacy, hopelessness, despair, etc. The fearful temper is likely to lead either to a feeling of personal inferiority or to the sentiment of group stigmatization. Whether it be the angry, or fearful description, temper reinforces the intensity of the symptom, which in turn increases the temperamental reaction. In this manner, a vicious cycle is established between temper and symptom. So there's the angry or aggressive temper when you feel like you've been wronged. And then there's the fearful or retreating temper when you feel that you're wrong. The temperamental reaction is kept alive mainly by the unsympathetic and unthinking attitude of the relatives. By means of coarse statements or subtle innuendo, they provoke loud explosions or silent agonies on the part of the patient. They tell him to use his willpower, implying that he makes no effort to get well. With this, they indict him as a weakling, worse yet, as shaming as pur- purposely shaming disease. They urge him to snap out of it, indicating that the symptoms are so easy to deal with that a mere snap would shake them out of existence. Excuse me. Other insinuations frequently leveled against the psychoneurotic or former mental patient are equally disconcerting. Complaining of fatigue, he is told not to be lazy. Mentioning his awful palpitations, he is admonished to be a man. The net result of this concerted environmental assault is that the patient is continually angry at his detractors and gradually accepting their insinuations, becoming more ashamed and fearful of himself. In telling the patient what wrong he has done, in telling the patient that wrong was done to him, and that he is wrong, his temper speaks to him, or that he is wrong, his temper speaks to him. The language which it uses is called temperamental lingo. Its vocabulary is limited to the terms right and wrong. Unless the patient learns to ignore the threats, warnings, and indictments of the temperamental lingo, he will be the victim of angry outbursts and fearful anticipations. His tenseness will be maintained and intensified. New symptoms will be precipitated and old ones fortified. Temper is most dangerous when it plays on the symptom itself by labeling sensations as intolerable, feelings as terrible, impulses as uncontrollable. The lingo discourages the patient from facing, tolerating, and controlling the reaction. The very sound of the labels intolerable, etc., is apt to rouse fear and defeatism. All a patient has to do is to call a crying reaction by the name of crying spell, and no effort will be made to check the burst of tears. The word spell suggests uncontrollability. Make the patient substitute crying habit for crying spell. The impossibility of stemming the flood at least will not be taken for granted. Similarly, if the patient raves about splitting headache, the dizziness that drives me mad, the pressure that I can't stand any longer, the fatalism of diction is bound to breed a despondency of mood. In order to prevent the temperamental response, the patient must be trained to ignore the whisperings of his temperamental lingo. The recovery language. The combined effects of symptomatic idiom and temperamental lingo are checkmated if the patient is made to use physician's language only. The member of the association call it proudly the recovery language. The most important parts of its vocabulary are the words sabotage and authority. The authority of the physician is sabotaged if the patient presumes to make a diagnostic, therapeutic, or prognostic statement. The verbiage of the temperamental lingo, unbearable, intolerable, uncontrollable, constitute sabotage because of the assumption that the condition is of serious nature, which is a diagnosis, or that it is difficult to repair, which is a prognosis. It is a crass example of sabotage if the claim is advanced that my headache is there the very minute I wake up. I didn't have time to think about it. It came before I even had a chance to become emotional. How can how can that be nervous? A statement of this kind throws a serious doubt on the validity of the physician's diagnosis and sabotages his authority. Likewise, it is a case of self-diagnosing and consequently sabotage to view palpitations as a sign of a heart ailment, of head pressure as meaning brain tumor, of sustained fatigue as leading to physical exhaustion. Once a physician has made the diagnosis of psychoneurotic or post-psychotic condition, excuse me, the patient is no longer permitted to indulge in the pastime of self-diagnosing. If he does, he is practicing sabotage. Patients are expected to lose their major symptoms after 2 months of recovery membership and class attendance. If after 2 months period the handicap persists in its original intensity, the indication is that sabotage is still in action. The patient still listens to the suggestions of the symptomatic idiom, fearing impending collapse and permanent handicap, or he gives ear to the verbal vagaries of the temperamental lingo, feeling helpless in the face of suffering. Clinging to his own mode of thinking, he sabotages the physician's effort. Contrary to expectation, it is comforting to the patient to be called a saboteur. Concerning himself as such, he knows that he has not yet learned to avoid resisting the physician. The not yet is reassuring. It suggests that in time he will learn. The patients encourage one another to wait until they get well. They warn one another against impatience. The most effective slogan handed down from veteran to novice is, wait till you will learn to give up sabotaging. Wait till you will learn to give up sabotaging. The spotting technique. If the patient is to check his sabotaging propensities, he must be trained to spot the inconsistencies and fallacies of his own language, whether it is merely conceived in silent thought or given formulation in vocal speech. To this end, the system of spotting techniques was evolved by means of which the members learned to reject the suggestion of the symptomatic idiom and the temperamental lingo whenever a symptom or a temperamental reaction occur. An extensive, though necessarily incomplete, description of the spotting technique is furnished in Part 3 of this book. Social activities. The social calendar of the organization is remarkably crowded. The activities are largely spontaneous and little supervised. Practically all events, be they group psychotherapy classes, public meetings, or family gatherings, are somehow linked to sociability. After a group of psychotherapy classes, the patients form a small groups, heading for the nearest drugstore or restaurant where they rehash the theme discussed in class or chat about private affairs. The most stimulating social event is the Kaffeeklatsch, following immediately upon the Saturday afternoon meeting. After the panel and the physicians have finished coffee latch. I can't pronounce that. I think it's another language. Hopefully they'll explain that. After the panel and the physician have finished their discussions, the assembly hall is speedily converted into a sort of lounge. The patients, relatives, and friends seat themselves around small tables and are treated to coffee and cake. Mothers and fathers then exchange views about the progress of their still suffering or already recovering offspring. The patients join the chat. The atmosphere is one of mutual encouragement, gratitude, and hopefulness. The Kaffeelatsch may last an hour or longer. The physician moves from group to group, engaging in brief conversation or listening to the stories and views presented by members and guests. This informal mingling with patients and relatives provides the physician with information which he could hardly obtain otherwise. The men and women speaking to him are spontaneous, divorced from the official cramping situation of the interview carried on in the ordinary examining rooms. Miss Jones reports an incident which she observed that Mrs. Smith, home on the occasion of his last family gathering. The account was his unreflective, reportorial, descriptive. These casual chats with the members are an invaluable means of acquainting the physician with the personal details of the patient's home life. The family gatherings are similarly patterned. A panel discussion of about 30 minutes is followed by a modest repast furnished by the family in whose home the meeting is held. The physician does not attend the family panels, but is currently kept informed by the panel leaders about what transpires, about adjustments and maladjustments of the patients, and about the quality of their home life prevailing in a particular family. The panel leaders meet with the physician once a month to receive special training in the matter of conducting the panels. This is again an occasion when a vast mass of information is conveyed to the physician about the home life of the patients. It need hardly be stressed that the type and quality of information which the physician is thus enabled to collect is vastly superior to that obtained in his examining room while interviewing and questioning parents and relatives. The members seem to have an almost unquenchable thirst for social contacts. They visit one another in their homes. They go together to shows and concerts, meet for lunches, for short trips, for joint visits to museums or parks, or for plain walks. Some groups have regular schedules for bowling, barn dancing, hiking, and swimming. The families of one North Side and one South Side group formed sewing circles. Consciously or unconsciously, the trend is to break through the dismal isolation and loneliness which has always been the blight of neurotic and post-psychotic existence. The patients state it explicitly that formerly they merely existed, now they live again. Formerly they were lonely individuals, now they are thoroughly integrated with the rich, pulsating life of a closely knit group. A happy outlet for this burning desire for sociability is afforded by the informal afternoon gatherings which take place at Recovery Headquarters, 116 South Michigan Avenue. A number of veterans, housewives mainly, volunteer each to spend one afternoon a week in the recovery office, supervising activities of that afternoon. Patients or relatives working in the Loop District drop in, partake of simple refreshments, and spend time chatting or asking advice or seeking reassurance for disturbing symptoms. The physician's office is 2 blocks distant. New patients are asked to visit the recovery office immediately after the termination of the initial exam. There they are met by the other patients and given information about the work of the organization. Panics, anxieties, and apprehensions are easily soothed by the calming influence of meeting other patients who, having suffered similar disturbances, are now presently the picture of good health. Membership, finances, administration. Membership at $3 per year is open to any psychoneurotic or former mental patient. At this writing, January 1950, the membership stands at 376. About 75% of the total is secured from the author's private clientele. The organization is financed by membership fees, donations, proceeds from the sale of recovery literature, collections at meetings. The organization is almost but not quite self-sustaining. The yearly deficit is met by the author. April 1948, the organization moved to its present larger quarters. With a considerable increased rental and the necessity for new furniture, the office equipment it was deemed wise to create a guarantee fund. The members responded promptly and generously to the appeal for contributions. The goal was $5,000, and close to $4,400 were collected. The affairs of the organization are conducted by the board of 3 directors, all ex-patients. Miss Annette Brocken, ex-patient and assistant principal of the Chicago Public School, is the president of the organization and chairman of the board of directors. Serving with her are a vice president, a secretary, a treasurer, and six counselors. The author does not hold office but functions as the medical director. An ex-patient is the editor of Recovery News. Another ex-patient holds the position of the executive secretary, doing all the routine work, including diction and typing. This is the only salaried employee. The monthly compensation is almost nominal. Recovery literature. Between 1938 and 1941, the organization published a bi-monthly magazine, Lost and Found. The author was the editor, contributing the bulk of articles. The pages of the magazine were devoted mainly to a thorough discussion of the influence of domestic temper on the fortunes of the patients. In 1943, its material was issued in book form in 3 volumes entitled The Techniques of Self-Help in Psychiatric Aftercare. The issue is now exhausted after a total sale of close to 1,000 copies. June 1946 to June 1947, the Recovery Journal was published. In consequence of rising cost of printing, it was discontinued after the 11th issue. It was succeeded by a phototyped news sheet, the Recovery News, which appeared 8 times a year. Each issue contains a contribution from the author. Subscription is included in the membership fee, and $2 per year for non-members. A second edition of the self-help techniques is in preparation. Recovery branches outside of Chicago. 8 branches of Recovery Inc. are now functioning outside the Chicago area. Following are the locations and dates of formation. Mascatine, Iowa, 1946. Brighton, Michigan, 1947. Evansville, Indiana, 1950. Louisville, Kentucky, 1951. St. Louis, Missouri, 1951. Burlington, Iowa, 1951. Denver, Colorado, 1951. Dixon, Illinois, 1951. Other branches are in the process of formation. The Denver branch is superintended by a local psychiatrist, and the others are led by ex-patients. The members meet regularly in their homes, read the recovery literature, cite examples from their own experience, and conduct panel discussions which are modeled after the pattern established in Chicago. The branches are visited by officers of the Chicago organization in intervals of about 6 months, and the leaders of the branches in turn come to Chicago to attend meetings and to perfect themselves in the techniques of panel leadership. I guess I could have skipped that, but okay. The results. It was stated that the objectives of the organization are 1. To help reduce the incidence of relapses and mental ailment and to prevent chronicity in psychoneurotic conditions. 2. To save time for the physician and expense for the patient. It would be easy to furnish imposing tables detailing percentages of improvement and failures. Tabulations of this kind, posing as objective statements, are usually nothing but subjective opinions, no matter how heavily they are buttressed by charts and graphs. They are particularly objectionable if compiled without the benefit of a well-organized long-range follow-up investigation. Since the latter was not available, no computation was attempted. Nevertheless, reasonable, valid conclusions as to the therapeutic effectiveness of the system can be drawn from the very nature and structure of the organization. The patients and relatives know one another, and if relapses, or continued chronicity were frequent occurrences, the membership would inevitably become discouraged and lose confidence. An unfortunate event which took place in October 1947 illustrates the point with striking force. A well-known member of the group relapsed into a depression and one morning ran into the path of a speeding train. It was not clear whether the fatal incident was suicide or an accident. Nevertheless, something in the nature of the demoralization swept the organization. Several of the ex-patients developed severe reaction. One of them had to be hospitalized. The fact that this has been the only instance of suicide, if such it was, in a period of close to 15 years during which many hundreds of manic depressive patients have had joined as active members, ought to be considered an eloquent testimony to the therapeutic efficiency of the system. This system would rapidly disintegrate if it failed to accomplish its therapeutic objectives. Statistical evidence does not seem required to demonstrate its success. Statistical figures, however, are available in support of the organization's second objective, i.e., its endeavor to effect substantial economies in the physician's time and the patient's expense. Due to the fact that the patients are disciplined, there is little quibbling and arguing in the physician's office, which means that the so-called resistance to his explanations and directions is reduced to a minimum. This alone allows an impressive savings in time. Another time-saving factor is the massive instruction given the patients in classes and meetings, and the assistance on continual study in the physician's writings. With resistance restricted and the patients coming to the office reasonably well instructed, the private interview can be terminated in a surprisingly small space of time. As a general rule, the author manages to see from 4 to 5 patients during 1 hour of his office time. Accordingly, the charges of the brief visit can be held to a moderate figure. In addition, the intensive class training and the equally intensive patient-to-patient contact make it possible to achieve improvements after a relatively short period of treatment. Total charges are thus lowered considerably. All patients are required to visit the physician's office for 6 consecutive months after the initial examination. They are seen once a week during the first month, once in 2 weeks in the second month. During the third and sixth month, through the 6th month, the office visits are reduced to only once every 4 weeks if symptoms and difficulties are significantly ameliorated. By the 2-week ratio continues if improvement lags. The average number of visits in 1947 was 11.9 per patient in a representative 6-month period. The maximum was 23, the minimum was 5, and the median was 12. That's the end of the preface. Thank you.